I was skimming resumes at my desk when my assistant knocked twice and stepped in, her eyes doing that careful thing people do when they already know you are not going to like what comes next. She said there was a couple in the lobby asking for me. No appointment, no referral, just insisting. I almost told her to send them away. Then she added one more detail. She said they used my old last name. That made my hand stop mid-page. I looked up at the glass wall facing the hall, and through it I saw two figures standing stiffly by the reception desk. For a second, my brain refused to connect the picture to any memory I wanted to touch. Then my chest tightened, and I knew. My parents had found me. Years after my father smirked across our dining table and told me I was not worth the investment, they were standing outside my office door like strangers who needed a favor. I stood up slowly, not because my legs were shaking, but because I wanted the movement to be mine, not a reflex. I smoothed the front of my blazer, the one that fit the way confidence fits, earned and tested, and I walked to the door without rushing. Through the glass, my mother looked smaller than I remembered. Her hair had more gray, pulled back too tight, like she had been trying to hold herself together all day and it still was not working. My father did not look smaller. He looked drained. The sharpness in him, the ease, the smug little certainty that used to fill every room he walked into, it was gone, like someone had finally taken a pin to it. My assistant hovered behind me. I could feel her curiosity like heat on the back of my neck. I kept my voice even and low and told her I would handle it. She nodded and slipped away, pretending not to watch. I opened the door. They both flinched at the sound, like they had not expected me to be the one to decide when the moment started. My mother's eyes flicked over me, my hair, my clothes, the badge on my lapel, the clean lines of the office behind me. She tried to smile. It did not land. My father swallowed hard, then straightened his shoulders as if that could restore whatever he had lost. Ava, my mother said, and her voice cracked on my name. I did not answer right away. I did not step aside. I stood in the doorway like a gate, because that was what I had become. A gate. My father cleared his throat. He began, then stopped. He tried again. We need to talk to you. Need. Not want. Not hope. Need. The word slid under my skin and hit something old, something bruised. The last time they had needed something, they had needed me to be someone else, someone safer, someone they could brag about at church or at the country club or at Thanksgiving dinner without having to explain why their daughter was choosing a path that did not come with guarantees. I kept my expression neutral. My voice came out calm, almost polite. Do you have an appointment? My mother's cheeks flushed. No, she said. We did not think. We did not know how. My father's eyes moved past me, into my office, to the framed prints on the wall, the shelf of awards, the conference table where clients sat and handed me their trust in neat little contracts. He tried to hide his surprise, but it leaked anyway, in the way his gaze lingered, in the way his jaw flexed. It would have been so easy in that moment to feel revenge in the dramatic sense, to enjoy their discomfort like dessert, to say something sharp and satisfying and watch them crumble. But what I felt first was simpler, colder. Control. I stepped back just enough to let them in, and I gestured toward the small sitting area near the window. 2 chairs and a low table, intentionally not the client couch. This was not a negotiation. This was a conversation I could end whenever I chose. They walked in like they were entering a stranger's home. My mother perched on the edge of the chair, hands clasped so tight her knuckles went pale. My father sat back, but not in the relaxed way he used to, more like he was bracing himself for impact. I remained standing for a second longer, then sat across from them, crossing one leg over the other with measured ease. I could feel the rhythm of my own breathing. I could feel how steady it was. My mother looked at my hands, then at my face, then away again. Ava, she said softly, I know it has been a long time. It has? I said. Silence pressed down, thick and awkward. Outside the window, the city moved like it always did. People walking with coffee cups, cars stopping and starting, a delivery truck easing into the loading zone. Life did not pause for family drama. It never had. My father finally spoke. He kept his voice careful, like he was handling glass. We heard you are doing well. I almost laughed, but I did not. I heard the sentence for what it was. A test. An attempt to see if praise still worked on me, if I would soften at the smallest crumb. I held his gaze. Yes, I said. I am. My mother's eyes shone a little and she nodded too quickly. We are proud of you, she whispered. Proud. The word should have warmed something in me. It did not. It felt late. It felt borrowed. It felt like a coat someone offered after pushing you into the snow. My father's fingers tapped his knee once, then stopped. He took a breath, and I saw the effort in it, the way he had to push the words out as if they had weight. We are in a difficult situation, he said. There it was. The reason. Not forgiveness, not regret. A situation. My mother leaned forward, desperate to fill in the space. Your father's company, she said. It is not doing well. There were changes. Contracts ended. A lawsuit. And then the bank. And then, she swallowed. Then he lost his position. My father's face tightened at the word lost, but he did not correct her. My mother went on, voice trembling. We have bills. We have debt. We have been trying to find work, but things are... She searched for a polite word. Things are complicated. I let her talk. I watched them talk around the real point like it was a bruise they did not want to press. Finally, my father said it, blunt because he did not know any other way. We need jobs. I blinked once, slowly, like I was processing, even though I had already known. It was the way he had looked at my office, the way he had studied the awards on my wall. He had come in here already planning to use what I had built. My mother's voice got smaller. We do not need anything fancy, she said. Just something stable. Something that can help us get back on our feet. Back on our feet. As if they had tripped and fallen, not made choices that took them here. My father leaned forward, elbows on his knees. He tried to pull his old authority back onto his shoulders. Ava, he said, you have a company. You must need help. Administrative, client support, anything. We are not too proud to work. The words almost made me smile, but not in kindness. In disbelief, not too proud. I thought of my younger self, standing in our dining room with a college acceptance letter in my hands, cheeks hot, heart beating in that hopeful way it only beats when you still believe the people who raised you might catch you if you fall. I could see the table, the polished wood, the folded napkins. My father's phone face down beside his plate, like the most important thing in the room. My mother's eyes flicking between us, already nervous. I could hear my own voice, careful and polite, asking why they would not help me when they could, asking like it was a reasonable question in a reasonable family, and I could hear my father's answer, not just the words, but the way he delivered them, calm, smug, as if he were reading numbers off a spreadsheet. Because you are not worth the investment. Not your plan is risky. Not we cannot afford it. Not maybe later. You. Not worth it. The memory snapped back so hard I felt it in my throat. I looked at them now. The same two people, years older, years weaker, and I wondered if they had any idea how much damage a sentence could do when it came from the mouths you trusted most. My mother's hands wrung together. Please, she said, and the word came out like a confession. Please do not shut the door on us. The door. She was talking about more than the office door. She was talking about the one I had closed on them when I stopped taking calls, stopped answering texts, stopped sending birthday cards that never got acknowledged anyway. My father's eyes hardened for a second, and I saw the old him flicker. The part that still believed he deserved. The part that still believed being a parent was a permanent claim. Then it faded again, and what was left was fear. I noticed the way his hands shook when he rested them on his knees. I noticed how my mother's wedding ring looked loose, how she kept turning it, twisting it, like she was trying to anchor herself to a life that was slipping. A quiet part of me wanted to ask 100 questions. What happened? How bad is it? Why now? A louder part of me wanted to ask one question only. Why did you think you could come here? Instead, I said something else. Tell me something, I said. Both of them froze. I leaned back slightly, keeping my voice steady. When you drove here today, what did you expect would happen? My father's mouth opened, then closed. He glanced at my mother, as if hoping she would handle it. My mother swallowed and tried to find the right tone, the mother tone, the one that used to smooth my hair and pack my lunches and make me believe everything would be okay. We hoped you would, she began. We hoped you would understand that people make mistakes. Mistakes, I repeated, and the word tasted bitter. My father's jaw tightened. We did what we thought was best, he said. There it was again. The same line, the same excuse wrapped in a new package. We did what we thought was best. As if what was best always aligned with what was convenient for them. I stared at him, and for a second I let myself feel the injustice plainly, without polishing it into something graceful. You thought it was best to tell your daughter she was not worth investing in, I said quietly. My mother flinched. Ava, she whispered, please. My father's eyes flickered, and for a moment he looked embarrassed, which was almost more shocking than anger. He rubbed a hand over his face. I did not mean it like that, he said. I felt something in my chest loosen. Not forgiveness. Recognition. That familiar rewriting. The way people try to sand down the sharpest edges of what they did once they realize the edge might cut them back. You meant it exactly like that? I said. You smiled when you said it. My mother's breath hitched. My father's cheeks reddened. I could feel my heart beating, but my voice did not rise. That was the difference between the girl at the dining table and the woman in the office. Back then, I would have begged for a softer version. I would have tried to fix the moment, to make it less ugly, to make myself smaller so my parents could feel bigger. Now, I let the ugliness sit in the room. My mother wiped at her eyes, but the tears were cautious, controlled. She was always good at crying just enough to look hurt, not enough to look guilty. I am sorry, she said, and the words were quiet, almost rehearsed. I am sorry we did not support you. Support, I thought. That was a safe word. It avoided the real one. Belief. They had not just withheld money. They had withheld belief. They had withheld respect. They had withheld the basic dignity of seeing me as a person with potential, not a gamble that might embarrass them. My father exhaled. Sharp. Ava, he said. Look. We are here because we need help. You have built something. You can give us a chance. A chance. The way he said it made it sound like it would cost him pride, like he was offering humility as payment. I looked around my office, the clean desk, the framed project boards, the view of downtown Chicago, the proof of every late night and every risk I took alone. I thought of my first apartment with thin walls and a broken heater. I thought of the jobs I took just to eat. I thought of the rejection emails, the clients who tried to underpay me, the way I learned to negotiate because nobody else was going to do it for me. They did not see any of that. Not really. They were seeing the end result and assuming they could step into it like it was theirs too. I said, "You did not come here as my parents." My mother blinked. "What do you mean?" I kept my gaze on my father. "You came here as applicants," I said, "as people who need something from the person you once dismissed." My father's lips pressed together. "That is not fair," he said. Fair. The word almost made me laugh again, and this time a small sound escaped. More breath than laughter, but enough that my mother stiffened. "You want to talk about fair?" I said softly. "You want to talk about what is fair in a family?" My mother's face crumpled. "Ava, please," she said again, like the word could rewind time. My father's voice sharpened. "We are not asking for charity." I tilted my head. "Then what are you asking for?" He hesitated. "Work," he said. "A job. A chance to earn." I nodded once. Slow. "Okay." Both of them leaned forward at the same time, like hope had yanked them by the spine. I held up a hand, not aggressive, just firm. "Let me finish." Their bodies froze again. I could feel the power in that small motion, the simple truth that I controlled the pace, that I could pause them mid-sentence, that I could choose when this ended. I said, "I do not hire people because they are related to me." My mother's eyes widened. "Ava," she started. I continued, "I hire people because they are qualified, because they fit the role, because I trust them, and because they respect the boundaries of this place." Boundaries. The word landed in the room like a new rule nobody had taught them. My father stared at me, and I could see him recalculating, trying to find the angle that used to work. The guilt angle, the authority angle, the family angle. He tried the family angle. "I am your father," he said, and his voice was tight. I met his gaze. "You are," I said, "and you are also the man who told me I was not worth the investment." My mother made a small sound, like a sob she swallowed. For a moment, none of us spoke. The office felt too quiet. Even the distant hum of the building seemed to fade. Then my mother whispered, "We did not know you would become this." This. She meant successful. She meant powerful. She meant a woman with her own name on a company door. I did not answer right away, because my first thought was sharp and cruel. You did not care if I did. Instead, I said something truer. "You did not need to know," I said. "You needed to believe I could." My father's eyes dropped for a second, just a second, but I saw it. And in that tiny crack, something shifted. Not in them. In me. I realized I was not waiting for an apology anymore, not the kind that would fix anything, not the kind that would make the past hurt less. I was waiting for myself to decide what kind of person I wanted to be in this moment, with all this power sitting in my hands. My mother wiped her cheeks again. "We are not here to hurt you," she said. "We are here because we have nowhere else. Nowhere else." I studied them, and I felt the old tug, the old instinct to protect, to patch, to smooth things over. It was an instinct built into me the same way my eye color was, something shaped by years of being the one who kept peace in a house where love was always tied to performance. But another instinct rose stronger, the instinct to protect myself. I glanced toward the window, then back to them. My voice stayed gentle, but it was edged with steel. "Before we talk about jobs," I said, "I need to understand something." My father frowned. "What?" I leaned forward slightly. "Tell me why you are really here." My mother's eyes darted to my father. He stiffened. My stomach tightened because I recognized that look. The look of a secret passing between them without words. The look of a hidden truth they had agreed not to say out loud unless they had to. My mother spoke too fast. "We told you," she said. "We need work." I did not move. I did not blink. I let the silence grow until it made them uncomfortable, because I had learned something in the years they did not know me. Silence is leverage. My father's throat bobbed as he swallowed. He stared at the carpet, then at the edge of my desk, anywhere but my face. Finally, he said, "It is complicated." My heart thudded once. Hard. Complicated meant there was more. Complicated meant this was not just about money. Complicated meant something had been happening in my absence, something that had brought them to my door with fear in their eyes. I sat back. My voice stayed even. "Then we are going to do this in order," I said. "You are going to tell me the whole story, and you are going to start at the beginning." My mother's hands trembled. "Ava," she whispered, "maybe we should not." My father snapped his eyes up. "We do not have a choice, Linda." Hearing my mother's name out loud in my office felt surreal, like I had opened a drawer I had kept locked for years and found the contents still sharp. I looked at them, both of them, and I felt the weight of the moment settle in my chest. "The beginning," I repeated. My father stared at me for a long time, and in his eyes I saw something I never expected to see from him. Uncertainty. He opened his mouth, then closed it, then opened it again. And right before he spoke, I felt that old memory rise, the dining table, the smirk, the sentence that had cut me loose. I realized I was not going to let them rewrite it this time. I was going to remember it exactly as it happened, and I was going to make them sit inside it with me. I drew a slow breath and held his gaze. "Start with the day I asked you about college," I said. "Start with the day you decided I was not worth the investment." The memory did not come back gently. It came back the way cold air does when a door is opened too fast, sharp and unavoidable. I was sitting across from them in my office, my father staring at his hands, my mother watching my face like she was waiting for permission to breathe, and suddenly, I was not there anymore. I was years younger, standing in a dining room that smelled like roasted chicken and lemon cleaner, holding a folded letter I had read so many times, the paper was already soft. That night had felt ordinary, which was what made it so dangerous. The table was set the way it always was. Plates warm, napkins folded neatly, my father's phone placed face down beside his fork, as if even silence belonged to him. My mother moved between the kitchen and the table, checking things that did not need checking, her shoulders already tense. I remember thinking that if I chose my words carefully enough, if I sounded calm and responsible, this conversation would go the way conversations were supposed to go in families like ours. I waited until we were seated. I waited until my father had taken his first bite. I waited because that was how I had learned to survive in that house, by waiting for the right moment that never really came. I told them I had been accepted. I slid the letter across the table, careful not to let my fingers shake. I talked about the program, the professors, the internships it could lead to. I talked about loans, about how much I could cover on my own. I made it very clear that I was not asking for everything, just help, just support, just a sign that they believed I was worth the effort. My father listened without interrupting, which I took as a good sign. He leaned back in his chair, chewing slowly, his eyes drifting toward the ceiling as if he were calculating something. My mother sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze flicking between us like she was watching a tennis match. When I finished, the silence stretched longer than it should have. I filled it with a nervous laugh and said that I knew it was a lot, but that I was willing to work hard, that I had thought this through. My father finally looked at me, not with anger, not with concern, with something colder. Amusement, maybe. He smiled, not the kind of smile that meant pride, but the kind that meant a decision had already been made. He told me he did not see the point. He said the degree was risky. He said the job market was unstable. He said people like us did not throw money at maybes. I started to respond, started to explain, But he raised a hand, not aggressively, just enough to stop me. Then he said it. Calmly, casually, as if he were talking about a stock he had decided not to buy. He said I was not worth the investment. The words landed before I could prepare for them. For a second, I did not understand what I had heard. I waited for him to clarify, to correct himself, to say the degree was not worth it, or the timing was bad. But he did not. He took another bite of his dinner, satisfied, like the conversation was over. My mother did not say anything. She looked down at her plate, then back up at me, her mouth opening slightly before closing again. She nodded once, small and quick, as if agreeing with a weather report. Something inside me went very quiet. Not the dramatic kind of quiet that comes before tears, but the stunned silence of a door locking itself. I asked him what he meant. I asked because some part of me still believed there had to be a misunderstanding. He explained, patiently, like he was talking to a child. He said investing in me did not make sense. He said my interests were not practical. He said he was protecting the family from bad decisions. My mother finally spoke then. She said they just wanted what was best for me. She said I would thank them later. She said stability mattered more than passion. What she did not say was that she disagreed. What she did not say was that I deserved a chance. I felt my face grow hot. I felt my heart pounding in my ears. I wanted to argue, to defend myself, to list all the reasons they were wrong. I wanted to tell them that this was my life, not a line item on a spreadsheet. But something stopped me. I saw it clearly in that moment, the way arguing would only confirm what they already believed. That I was emotional. That I was impractical. That I did not understand how the world worked. So I stopped talking. The silence stretched again, thicker this time. My father wiped his mouth and reached for his phone. My mother asked if anyone wanted dessert. That was it. No apology, no second thought, no recognition of what they had just taken from me. I excused myself and went to my room. I closed the door and sat on the edge of my bed staring at the wall. I did not cry right away. I felt hollow, like something essential had been removed, and my body had not figured it out yet. Over the next few days, nothing changed in the house. My parents went to work. My mother asked if I wanted leftovers for lunch. My father asked if I had finished my applications, as if the conversation had never happened. I moved through those days like a ghost. I stopped bringing up school. I stopped sharing my plans. I learned very quickly that silence was safer than hope. At night, I lay awake replaying the sentence in my head. Not worth the investment. It echoed in ways I did not have language for yet. It was not just about money. It was about trust. It was about being seen as someone worth believing in. I started to understand something painful and clarifying. Their love had conditions. Their support came with rules. And when I stepped outside those rules, I became a liability. That realization did not make me angry at first. It made me ashamed. Ashamed for wanting more. Ashamed for believing, even briefly, that they would choose me over their comfort. I did not ask again. I did not push. I quietly started making plans that did not include them. I looked for apartments. I took extra shifts. I learned how to calculate rent down to the dollar. When the day came that I packed my bags, my parents acted surprised. My mother asked why I was in such a rush. My father asked if this was really necessary. I told them I needed space. I did not tell them the truth, that staying felt like agreeing with them, that leaving was the only way I could keep myself intact. As I zipped my suitcase, my mother stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her expression tight. She asked where I was going. I told her I had found a place. She asked how I would afford it. I told her I had figured it out. She nodded, the same small nod she had given at the dinner table. the nod of someone who does not want to argue but also does not want to help. My father did not come to the door. He was on the phone in the living room, his voice low and confident, talking about business. I waited for him to hang up. He did not. I left without a goodbye. The first night alone was harder than I expected. The room was small and smelled faintly of old carpet and someone else's cooking. I lay on the bed, listening to unfamiliar noises through thin walls, and felt the fear creep in now that there was nothing left to distract me. That was when the anger arrived. Not loud, not explosive, but steady and hot. It sat in my chest and refused to go away. It reminded me of the way my father had smiled when he said the words. It reminded me of my mother's silence. I told myself I would not go back. I told myself I would not call. I told myself that if I broke, it would not be because they had decided I was not enough. Sitting in my office years later, watching my parents struggle to explain themselves, that anger felt different. It was no longer raw. It was shaped, directed. I realized then that the sentence they had delivered so calmly had not just pushed me out of their house, it had pushed me into myself. It had forced me to grow in ways comfort never would have. I looked at them across the table, my father's shoulders slumped, my mother's eyes glossy with regret she did not know how to name, and I understood something with painful clarity. That night at the dining table had been the end of the daughter they thought they knew. And it had been the beginning of someone they never bothered to imagine. I took a slow breath and brought my attention back to the present. They were still waiting. My father's fingers were still twisting together. My mother was still watching me like I might disappear if she looked away. I knew now that what came next was not about rehashing the past. It was about what that past had made possible. And for the first time since I walked out of that house, I felt ready to keep going. Leaving did not happen in one dramatic moment. It happened in a series of quiet decisions that stacked on top of each other until staying felt heavier than going. After that dinner, I stopped trying to explain myself. I moved through the house carefully, like I was borrowing space that no longer belonged to me. I kept my plans to myself. I smiled when spoken to. I learned how easy it was to disappear while still living under the same roof. My parents did not notice at first. Or maybe they noticed and chose not to look too closely. My mother continued asking practical questions about dinner and laundry. My father continued talking about work as if nothing had shifted. The house ran on routine, and routine has a way of smoothing over damage until it feels permanent. At night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the sentence over and over. Not worth the investment. I tested it in my mind, changing the emphasis, hoping it would soften. It never did. It sat there, solid and final. I realized then that the decision had already been made for me. If I stayed, I would be agreeing with them. I would be living inside a future where my worth had already been decided. So I started preparing quietly. I searched for apartments late at night on my phone, scrolling through listings that looked impossibly small and impossibly expensive. I learned how to calculate rent, utilities, groceries, and bus fare down to the dollar. I took extra shifts where I could. I cut expenses before I even had any money to cut. Each small step felt like placing a brick under my feet. Something solid where there had been nothing. The morning I told them I was leaving, the house was unusually quiet. My mother stood at the kitchen counter with a mug she was not drinking from. I told her I had found a place and would be moving out soon. She looked at me like I had just told her the weather had changed unexpectedly. She asked how I planned to manage. I told her I had a job lined up and enough saved for the first month. She nodded, that same small nod, and said she hoped I knew what I was doing. My father was in the living room on a call. I waited for him to finish, standing there with my bag by my side. He did not notice me. When I finally interrupted, he looked irritated more than concerned. I told him I was moving out. He asked if this was really necessary. I said yes. That was the closest we came to a goodbye. When I closed the front door behind me, I expected to feel something dramatic. Relief, grief, fear, anything sharp enough to match the moment. Instead, I felt strangely calm, the kind of calm that comes after making a decision you know you cannot undo. My first place was small and uncomfortable, and exactly what I could afford. The walls were thin. The heater rattled. The window faced another building so close I could see into someone else's living room. I set my bag down on the floor and sat on the bed, listening to sounds that did not belong to me. Laughter through the wall, a television playing somewhere above, footsteps in the hallway. That was when the fear finally caught up with me. I had no safety net, no one to call if I failed, no one who would step in quietly and fix things if I made the wrong choice. The reality of it pressed down on my chest until breathing felt like work. And then the anger arrived. It was not loud. It did not come with tears or shouting. It settled into me like heat, steady and constant. It reminded me why I was here. It reminded me of the smirk, the silence, the way my future had been discussed like a bad purchase. That anger got me up the next morning. I took the first job that would have me. It was not related to anything I had planned for myself. It was work that paid hourly and expected me to show up on time and not ask questions. I learned quickly. I kept my head down. I did what was asked and then some. Every dollar mattered. Every shift mattered. The days blurred together. Wake up early, commute, work, come home exhausted, eat something simple, fall asleep to the sound of strangers living their lives on the other side of thin walls. There was no room for dreaming yet. Survival came first. Some nights, the anger would flare again, especially when I was tired. It whispered that this was unfair, that other people did not have to start this far behind. I let myself feel it, but I did not let it stop me. Anger can be destructive if you let it run wild, but it can also be fuel if you keep it contained. I promised myself one thing during those early weeks. I would not go back and ask for help. Not out of pride, but out of necessity. Going back would mean reopening a wound that had barely begun to scar over. There were moments when it almost broke me, when an unexpected expense hit, when I lay awake counting bills instead of sheep, when I watched other people my age move through the world with a confidence I had not yet earned. But there was something else happening alongside the struggle, something quiet. Without my parents watching, without their commentary shaping every decision, I began to notice myself. What held my attention? What made time pass faster? What problems I liked solving? It was not yet a plan, more like a faint outline, a sense that there was something in me they had never bothered to understand. I started using that part of myself in small ways, almost secretly, late at night, on weekends, in moments when the anger had nowhere else to go. I did not tell anyone. I did not need validation yet. I just needed to see if it was real. The first time I realized it might be, I felt something close to hope, and hope scared me more than fear ever had. Hope meant risk. Hope meant opening myself up to disappointment again. So I stayed cautious. I kept working. I kept saving. I kept showing up. Months passed. The routine hardened into something livable. I learned the rhythms of my neighborhood. I learned which groceries were cheapest and which corners felt safe after dark. I learned that I could survive more than I had thought. I did not hear from my parents during that time. No calls, no messages, no attempts to check in. The silence hurt more than any argument would have. It confirmed what I had already suspected. Without usefulness, I was easy to forget. That realization did something important. It detached me. It loosened the last threads of obligation I had been carrying without realizing it. One evening, after a long shift, I sat on my bed and looked around the room. It was still small, still imperfect, but it was mine. I had paid for it. I had earned the right to be there. I thought about the house I had left behind, the dining room table, the polished routines, the quiet judgments disguised as concern, and for the first time, I did not feel pulled back toward it. I felt pointed forward. I understood then that walking away had not been an act of defiance. It had been an act of alignment. I had stepped out of a story where I was always going to be a disappointment, and into one where the ending was not written yet. The anger was still there, but it had changed. It was no longer just about what they had done to me. It was about what I refused to let that moment take from me. As I fell asleep that night, the noise through the walls faded into the background. I did not know where this path would lead. I did not have a clear plan or a safety net waiting at the end. But I knew one thing with certainty. I had left with nothing but anger, and that anger was teaching me how to stand on my own. Life settled into a rhythm that did not care about my feelings. Alarm, commute, work, come home, eat something quick, sleep, repeat. It was not the kind of life people romanticize when they talk about independence, but it was real, and it was mine. The anger that had carried me out of my parents' house did not disappear. It simply changed form. It became quieter, more focused, less explosive. It sat in the background like a low hum, reminding me why I kept going even when I was tired. I worked hard at the job I had taken, even though it was not where I wanted to end up. I showed up early. I stayed late when needed. I learned quickly. Not because I loved the work, but because I understood something important. No one was going to save me if I failed. Every shift I missed, every mistake I made, would land squarely on me. That kind of pressure sharpens you. But it was what I did after work that began to matter most. At night, when the apartment finally went quiet and the sounds through the walls softened into background noise, I pulled out the part of myself my parents had always dismissed, the thing they had called impractical, the thing they had smiled at indulgently when I was younger, as if it were a phase I would grow out of. I did not announce it. I did not tell anyone. I opened my laptop and worked quietly, experimenting, learning, refining. Sometimes I lost track of time. Sometimes hours passed without me noticing. That never happened at my day job. That difference mattered. I remembered my father's voice, the way he talked about stability and reputation and sensible choices. I remembered how quickly he had categorized my interests as risky, how easily he had decided they were not worth backing. For years, I had half believed him. Not enough to stop caring, but enough to keep myself small. Now, alone in my cramped apartment, that belief began to loosen. At first, I treated it like a secret, something I did only for myself. I told myself it was just a way to stay sane, a way to channel the anger into something that did not destroy me. I did not expect it to lead anywhere. Expectation felt dangerous. Then one night, something shifted. It was a small thing, almost nothing. I had been working on a personal project, something I had started just to challenge myself. I showed it to a coworker the next day, not because I was seeking validation, but because it came up naturally in conversation. She leaned closer, studied the screen, and asked how long I had been doing that. I shrugged and said for a while. She looked at me differently after that. Not impressed exactly, but curious. She asked questions, real questions, about how I approached problems, about why I made certain choices. No one had ever asked me those questions before. Later that week, she mentioned my work to someone else, that someone else mentioned it to another person. Nothing dramatic happened. No offers, no big break. But a door cracked open. The first time someone asked if I could help them with something, really help, not just give an opinion. My instinct was to say no. I heard my father's voice in my head warning me about wasting time, about taking on things that would not pay off. I almost listened. Then I remembered the dining table, the smirk, the sentence, and I said yes. I worked on that project late into the night, fueled by something that felt dangerously close to hope. When I delivered it, the response was immediate and genuine. They thanked me. They used what I had created. It made a difference. I stared at the message on my phone longer than necessary, letting it sink in. This was not charity. This was not someone being nice. This was value being recognized. That realization was unsettling. It forced me to confront how much of my self-doubt had been inherited. How many times I had downplayed my abilities because it was easier than challenging the narrative I had grown up with. I began to take myself more seriously, even if no one else did yet. I set aside specific time for this work. I invested in learning, not because someone told me to, but because I wanted to see how far I could go. I stopped apologizing for caring. There were still days when fear crept in, days when exhaustion made everything feel fragile. On those days, I reminded myself that this skill had survived being ignored. That mattered. One afternoon, someone I barely knew asked me where I had learned to do what I did. I told them the truth, on my own. They nodded and said that made sense. They said it explained why my approach felt different. Different. Not wrong. Not risky. Different. That word stayed with me. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, my world expanded. Not in dramatic leaps, but in quiet accumulations. One connection led to another. One project led to a slightly bigger one. The work I did after hours began to feel less like a secret and more like a foundation. I did not quit my job. I was not reckless. Survival still came first, but something inside me had shifted. I was no longer just enduring. I was building. There was a night when I sat back in my chair and realized I was no longer working out of spite. The anger was still there, but it was no longer driving every decision. What was driving me now was curiosity, a desire to see what would happen if I stopped treating myself like a liability. That realization was both liberating and terrifying. If my parents had been right, if this really was a dead end, then I would have to own that failure completely. There would be no one else to blame. But if they were wrong, then everything changed. I thought about how easily they had dismissed me, how quickly they had categorized my future as a bad bet. And I understood something important. Their judgment had not been based on my ability. It had been based on their fear. Fear of uncertainty. Fear of embarrassment. Fear of not being able to control the outcome. I did not share that insight with anyone. I kept it to myself, letting it harden into resolve. One evening, after finishing a project that pushed me further than anything I had done before, I closed my laptop and leaned back against the wall. My apartment was still small. My bank account was still fragile. But I felt something I had not felt in a long time. Respect. For myself. I knew this skill would complicate my life. It would introduce risk. It would demand more of me than comfort ever had. But I also knew I could not unsee its potential now that I had felt it. The thing my parents had never taken seriously was becoming the one thing I could not afford to ignore. I went to bed that night with my mind racing, not with fear, but with possibility. I did not know where this path would lead, only that it was mine to walk. And somewhere deep down, I understood that the world I had left behind would not stay separate forever. What I was building in quiet corners was going to surface, sooner than I expected. The change did not announce itself with applause. It crept in quietly, the way morning light does when you forget to close the blinds. After that night when possibility kept me awake, the days began to feel heavier and sharper at the same time. Every decision carried more weight. Every hour felt like it mattered. I had crossed some invisible line, and there was no going back to pretending this was just something I did to cope. The small projects started stacking up. One led to another, then another. People talked. Not loudly, not publicly, but enough. I noticed the shift before anyone said it outright. Messages became more specific. Requests came with expectations attached. Deadlines appeared. The work stopped being a favor and started looking like responsibility. At first, that terrified me. I remember sitting at my kitchen table one evening, laptop open, bills pushed to the side, staring at a message that asked if I could take on something bigger. Bigger than anything I had done before. Bigger than what felt reasonable for someone still working a day job and sleeping in a studio with a rattling heater. My first instinct was to say no. Not because I did not want it, but because I did. Wanting something made it dangerous. Wanting something meant I could lose it. I thought about my parents, the way they had dismissed my interests without curiosity, the way they had decided for me what was sensible. I realized that fear had always been their language. Fear of risk, fear of embarrassment, fear of losing control. I was tired of living inside that language. So I said yes. The moment I committed, everything shifted. My calendar filled. My evenings disappeared. My weekends turned into long stretches of focused work. The exhaustion was real, but it was different from the exhaustion I felt at my day job. This one felt earned, chosen. There was a night when I sat back after finishing a deliverable and realized my hands were shaking. Not from fear, but from the adrenaline of pulling something off that I had not known I could do. The response came quickly. It was not dramatic praise. It was simple and direct. This worked. This helped. This mattered. That was the first time I felt leverage. Not power in the loud sense, not control over anyone, but leverage over my own life. I had something that created value beyond survival. Something people needed. Something that made me less replaceable. That realization unsettled me more than failure ever had. With leverage came scrutiny, questions, expectations. I could feel eyes on me, even when no one was looking directly. The safety of invisibility was gone. If I failed now, it would be visible. There were moments when I wondered if I had moved too fast, when I questioned whether this was arrogance masquerading as courage. On those nights, I reminded myself that staying small had never protected me. It had only kept me quiet. The work itself became a test, not just of skill, but of judgment. There were decisions where there was no clear right answer, only trade-offs. I learned to trust my instincts, not because they were perfect, but because they were informed, built from trial, error, and a lifetime of reading rooms carefully. One afternoon, someone I had never met asked for my opinion in a meeting. Not as a courtesy, but as a necessity. I spoke, and the room listened. I felt the shift then, tangible and undeniable. My voice carried weight. Afterward, I sat alone in my car for a few minutes, hands resting on the steering wheel, heart still racing. I thought about the dining room table, about how easily my voice had been dismissed there, about how little it had mattered. I understood then that leverage was not about proving someone wrong. It was about becoming someone whose absence would be noticed. The pressure increased. Expectations grew sharper. There were nights when I slept poorly, replaying decisions, anticipating problems that had not happened yet. But there was a clarity underneath the stress. This pressure was not imposed. It was the cost of being taken seriously. That distinction mattered. I began to set boundaries without realizing it. I stopped saying yes to everything. I learned how to negotiate, how to ask for time, how to protect my energy. Each boundary felt like a quiet reclaiming of something I had given away too easily in the past. One evening, while reviewing notes, I caught myself smiling at a problem instead of dreading it. That scared me more than anything else. Enjoyment meant attachment. Attachment meant stakes. But it also meant growth. I started to understand the shape of my leverage. It was not flashy. It did not rely on titles or inherited status. It came from consistency, from delivering when it mattered, from seeing patterns others missed. And slowly, my name began to travel without me. Not in my family's world yet, not directly, but close enough that the distance felt thinner. I heard it in passing comments, in surprised looks, in questions that assumed competence rather than asked for permission. I thought about how my parents would react if they knew. If they heard my name spoken with respect in rooms they had always believed belonged to them. The thought did not bring satisfaction. It brought a strange calm. Because I knew something they did not. Leverage changes how people approach you. It changes the tone of conversations. It changes who reaches out and why. And it reveals intentions with brutal clarity. I was not asking to be included anymore. I was being approached. That shift was subtle, but irreversible. One night, after a long week, I stood by my window and looked out at the city lights. My apartment was still small. My life was still busy and imperfect. But the ground beneath me felt solid in a way it never had before. I had built something quietly, without permission, without backing, without belief from the people who were supposed to give it freely. For the first time, I understood what it meant to have leverage over my own future. And somewhere beyond my line of sight, in a world I had left behind, that leverage was about to be noticed. The first sign that things were changing came so quietly I almost missed it. I was in the middle of a long afternoon, juggling emails and deadlines, when someone mentioned my name in passing like it was already familiar. It was not a compliment or a big announcement, just a casual reference, the way people talk about someone they assume everyone else already knows. I felt it land in my chest before my mind caught up. At first, I told myself it meant nothing. People talk. Names drift. But it kept happening. A question here. A nod there. Someone asking if I was the same person who had worked on a project they had admired. The recognition was not loud, but it was steady, and it carried a different kind of weight. This was not curiosity anymore. This was expectation. My days filled up faster. Meetings ran longer. Decisions that once would have been handled above me were now dropped into my lap. I noticed how people watched my reactions, how they waited for my response before moving forward. It was subtle, but unmistakable. I had crossed from being helpful to being necessary. That realization was both grounding and unsettling. I had wanted to be taken seriously, but I had not fully considered what came with it. Being needed meant being seen. Being seen meant being remembered. And memory has a way of traveling farther than you intend. The overlap began where I least expected it. One afternoon, during a routine conversation, someone mentioned a company my father used to work with. It was said casually, without significance, but my body reacted before my thoughts did. My shoulders tightened. My breath caught. I forced myself to stay neutral, to keep listening. They went on, talking about changes, about leadership shifts, about how unstable things had become. I nodded at the appropriate moments, asked professional questions, kept my voice even. Inside, something cold and alert was waking up. I told myself it was coincidence. The world is smaller than we think, but not everything is connected. Still, I could not shake the feeling that a line I had drawn years ago was starting to blur. The confirmation came from someone who had no idea what they were stepping into. We were standing in a hallway after a meeting, making small talk, when they asked me if I was related to a man who shared my last name. They mentioned it lightly, like a fun coincidence. said they had heard that name recently in a very different context. I felt the moment stretch. I could have answered honestly. I could have said yes, that is my father. I could have claimed the connection like it was something neutral, something harmless. I did not. I smiled and said I was not sure, that it was a common name, that it happened all the time. The lie slid out easily, not because I was ashamed, but because I was protective. I was not ready to let that door open. The person shrugged and moved on, unaware that they had confirmed what I had already begun to sense. The world I had left was circling closer. That night I thought about how strange it was that my parents had never once asked what I was doing after I left. They had not checked in. They had not been curious. They had not tried to understand. And yet, now that my name was moving without me, now that others were attaching value to it, the distance felt thinner. I wondered what they had heard, if anything. I wondered how my name sounded in rooms I was not in. The answer came indirectly, the way uncomfortable truths often do. Someone forwarded me an article about industry changes, something I might find relevant. Buried halfway through was a reference to a situation that made my stomach drop. It was vague enough to pass unnoticed by most readers, but specific enough that I recognized it immediately. A company tied to my father. Financial strain, reputational damage. I read it twice, then a third time. I felt no satisfaction, no sense of justice, just a quiet acknowledgement that consequences move, whether we watch them or not. More details followed over the next few weeks. Not through my parents, but through the professional grapevine. A contract lost, a leadership role dissolved, a scramble to recover footing that was no longer there. I absorbed the information without reacting outwardly. It was not my place to intervene, not anymore. Then came the message. It arrived late in the evening, from a number I did not recognize. The wording was familiar enough that my chest tightened instantly. The careful politeness, the vague concern, the subtle guilt tucked between lines. They said they hoped I was well. They said they had heard I was doing impressive things. They said they would love to reconnect and talk. They did not say why. I stared at the screen for a long time. I felt the old reflex rise, the one that urged me to respond quickly, to be accommodating, to smooth things over. I let it pass. I did not reply. The silence that followed was deliberate. It was not avoidance. It was choice. More messages came over the next few days, each one slightly more urgent than the last. Still polite, still careful, still avoiding the point. I read them all. I answered none. In that silence, I felt the shift fully settle into place. The balance had changed. The people who once decided my worth without consulting me now needed something I controlled. And they did not know how to ask for it directly. That realization did not make me feel powerful in the way movies promise. It made me feel steady, grounded. For the first time, I was not reacting to them. I was observing. I noticed patterns I had never seen clearly before. The way urgency crept into their tone. The way familiarity was deployed strategically, like a tool. The way my absence was suddenly a problem, not an inconvenience. I did not enjoy it, but I understood it. One afternoon, as I wrapped up a meeting, someone mentioned that my parents had been asking around, trying to make connections, trying to find an opening. The words were neutral, but the implication was not. I thanked them and changed the subject. Inside, something clicked into place. They were running out of options. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, the city humming outside my window. I thought about the girl who had left home with a suitcase and nothing else. About how alone she had felt. About how convinced she had been that she would never matter in the way her parents respected. I thought about how quietly things had changed. The power shift had not come from confrontation. It had come from absence, from building a life without waiting for permission, from letting my name earn meaning on its own terms. I realized then that the next step was inevitable. Indirect contact would not be enough for them anymore. They would need to see me, to face the reality they had ignored. I took a slow breath and let the thought settle. I was no longer afraid of that moment. They once decided my value in private, behind closed doors, with a sentence that cut deeper than they ever intended. Soon, if they wanted access to what I had built, they would have to come to me openly, and I would decide what happened next. They did not come to me directly at first. They circled, testing the edges, hoping I would make it easier for them. I could feel it in the tone of the messages that finally broke the silence, careful and respectful, in a way they had never been with me before. They asked if I had time to talk, if I might be open to a conversation, if it would be possible to meet. The words were polite, but the need beneath them was unmistakable. I did not answer right away. I let the messages sit, not out of cruelty, but because I needed to understand what I felt before responding. There was a part of me that wanted to protect the calm I had built. Another part wanted to see them, to confirm with my own eyes that the balance had truly shifted. When I finally agreed to meet, I chose the place and the time. Neutral ground, public. Somewhere familiar to me, not to them. That decision alone felt like a small reclamation of power. I arrived early, more out of habit than nerves. The space buzzed quietly around me, people moving in and out, conversations blending into background noise. I ordered a drink and sat where I could see the door without being on display. My hands were steady. That surprised me. They arrived together, which I expected. My father walked slightly behind my mother, his shoulders rounded in a way I had never seen before. She scanned the room until she spotted me, her expression shifting through relief and apprehension in quick succession. When their eyes met mine, they both hesitated, like they were unsure whether to approach or retreat. I stayed seated. The moment stretched as they walked toward me, each step carrying years of unspoken history. When they reached the table, my mother smiled, tentative and brittle. My father nodded once, stiff and formal. They sat down without being invited, an old habit asserting itself before they caught it. For a few seconds, none of us spoke. I watched them the way I had learned to watch rooms, attentive and detached. My mother's hands fidgeted in her lap. My father avoided my eyes, focusing instead on the surface of the table as if it held answers. My mother broke the silence first. She said it was good to see me. She said I looked well. Her voice carried a careful warmth, like someone testing water they feared might be cold. I thanked her. My tone was neutral, polite, professional. It felt strange, but right. My father cleared his throat. He said he had heard good things about my work. He said my name had come up in conversations lately. He paused, as if waiting for me to fill in the gap with reassurance or humility. I did neither. I nodded and said I had been busy. The shift was immediate. Without my participation, their script faltered. My mother glanced at my father, a silent prompt. He took a breath and leaned forward slightly. He said things had been difficult. He said circumstances had changed. He said the business was facing challenges they had not anticipated. Each sentence was carefully constructed to avoid the word need, but it hovered between us, heavy and undeniable. I listened without interrupting. I had learned long ago that silence makes people reveal more than questions ever could. My mother added that they had always known I was capable, that they had worried about me when I left, that they had hoped I would find my way. Her voice softened on those last words, an attempt at rewriting the past that did not quite land. I did not challenge her. I did not correct her. I let the statements hang in the air, unsupported. My father finally said what they had come to say. He asked if I might be willing to help them. He framed it as advice at first, then as consultation, then, when neither seemed sufficient, as an opportunity. He spoke carefully, measuring each word, trying to balance authority with humility in a way that did not come naturally to him. He said they respected my expertise. The irony of that statement settled into my bones. I asked what kind of help they were looking for. My voice was calm, steady. I watched relief flicker across their faces, misinterpreting my question as agreement. They explained their situation in broad strokes, skimming over mistakes, emphasizing external factors. I recognized the pattern. Responsibility diluted just enough to avoid accountability. When they finished, my mother leaned in slightly, her eyes searching my face. She said this could be good for all of us. She said family should support each other. She said it would mean a lot to them. I let a few seconds pass before responding. Not for effect, but because I wanted to choose my words carefully. I told them I appreciated their honesty. I told them I understood the position they were in. I told them I would need to consider whether I was the right person to help. My father straightened, a hint of his old confidence returning. He began to talk about timelines and expectations, about how quickly things would need to move. I raised a hand gently and stopped him. I said if we were going to talk about working together, there were some things we needed to be clear about first. My voice did not waver. My heart did not race. That surprised me most of all. I told them I did not work out of obligation. I told them I did not take on projects without clear boundaries. I told them that any professional relationship would be exactly that. Professional. The air at the table shifted. My mother's expression tightened. My father's jaw set. I continued. I said my rates were non-negotiable. I said my time was limited. I said I would not be available for last-minute demands or emotional pressure. I said I would need full authority over my scope of work. They exchanged a look, quick and sharp. My father asked if I was serious. I said yes. My mother asked if this was really necessary. She said we were family. That was the moment the room went very still. I told her family did not protect me when it mattered. I told her I had built my life without their support. I told her I would not put that stability at risk now. The words landed harder than I intended, but I did not take them back. My father leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. For a moment I thought he might push back, might assert himself the way he always had. Instead, he exhaled slowly. He asked if this was how it was going to be. I said this was how it already was. Silence settled between us again, heavier this time. I watched them process the reality that had been years in the making, that the daughter they had dismissed was now the one setting terms, that the leverage had shifted irrevocably. My mother's eyes filled with tears. She tried to blink away. She said she never meant to hurt me. She said they had done what they thought was best. I told her intentions did not erase impact. We sat like that for a while, the noise of the room flowing around us, oblivious. I felt no urge to comfort her. That was new. I felt no need to soften the truth to make it easier to swallow. Eventually, my father nodded once, a small concession. He said they would need to discuss things privately. He said they would get back to me. I agreed. I stood, gathering my things, signaling the end of the meeting. My mother stood as well, hesitating like she wanted to say something else, something personal. She did not. As I walked away, I felt the familiar tremor in my hands, but it was not fear. It was release. Outside, the air felt cooler, sharper. I took a deep breath and let it fill my lungs. The meeting had gone exactly as it needed to, not how they wanted. They had come expecting access. They had left with conditions. And for the first time since that night at the dining table, I knew they understood exactly what it meant to underestimate me. Whether they accepted my terms or not no longer mattered. The line had been drawn. What came next would reveal more than any conversation ever could. The days after that meeting passed more slowly than I expected, not because I was waiting for their response, but because I was paying closer attention to myself. I noticed how my body reacted when my phone buzzed, how quickly my mind filled in possibilities before I checked the screen. I noticed how easily I returned to my routines, how little they had actually disrupted my life. That surprised me. There had been a time when any contact from them would have knocked me off balance for days. A single sentence could undo weeks of progress. Now, after laying out my terms and walking away, I felt something steadier underneath the surface. Not indifference, awareness. They did not call right away. They did not text. The silence stretched into a few days, then a week. I did not fill it. I kept working. I kept meeting deadlines. I kept my life moving in the direction it had already chosen. People around me noticed the shift before I did. A colleague commented that I seemed more focused. Another said I carried myself differently, like someone who knew where she was headed. I smiled and thanked them, but inside I knew the truth. I was not more confident because of success. I was more confident because I had finally drawn a line and stayed on my side of it. When my parents' message finally came, it was shorter than the others had been. Direct. They said they had thought carefully about what I had said. They said they wanted to move forward. They asked when we could talk again to discuss next steps. I read the message once, then again. I felt no rush of triumph, no sense of victory, just clarity. I replied that if they wanted to discuss working together, they could send their proposal in writing, outlining their expectations and timelines. I said I would review it like any other inquiry and respond accordingly. I did not soften the language. I did not add reassurance. The proposal arrived 2 days later. It was thorough, polished, and revealing. They had done their homework. They had adjusted their tone. They had acknowledged my authority without explicitly admitting fault. It was careful in the way people are careful when they realize they no longer have the upper hand. I read it slowly, not for content alone, but for what sat between the lines, where they hesitated, where they over-explained, where they tried to anticipate my objections. What stood out most was what was missing. There was no mention of the past, no acknowledgement of the sentence that had changed everything, no apology, direct or indirect. I sat back and stared at the wall for a long time after finishing. Not because I was conflicted, but because I needed to be honest with myself. This was the moment I had once imagined as a kind of triumph. The moment they came asking. The moment I could say yes or no. And yet, the question I was asking myself had nothing to do with revenge. It was simpler and harder than that. Could I engage with them without shrinking? Without slipping back into patterns I had worked so hard to dismantle? Could I help without hoping, without waiting for recognition that might never come? The answer came quietly. I realized that I did not need their apology to move forward. I needed my boundaries to be respected. And if they could not do that, no amount of professional success would make the arrangement worth it. I responded with revisions. Clear, specific, uncompromising. I outlined my scope. I clarified my authority. I reiterated my rates and timelines. I added one condition they had not anticipated. I said all communication would go through me directly, not through my mother, not filtered through family dynamics. I said feedback would be handled professionally, not emotionally. I said if those terms were not acceptable, we would part ways without resentment. I sent the message and closed my laptop. That night, I slept deeply. When their reply came, it was shorter than the last. They agreed. The work began almost immediately. Meetings were scheduled, documents were shared, decisions were made. From the outside, it looked like a normal professional collaboration. From the inside, it felt like walking through a familiar house that had been rearranged. My father listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, his words were measured, careful. My mother tried to insert herself at first, offering opinions that drifted toward the personal. I redirected gently but firmly, bringing the focus back to the task at hand. There were moments of tension. Old habits surfaced. Authority was tested. Each time I held the line, not with anger, with consistency. I could see it in their faces when they realized I would not bend, when they understood that my competence was not something they could selectively acknowledge, that it came as a whole. Something shifted then, not dramatically, subtly. They stopped trying to manage me. They started responding to me. That distinction mattered. Still, there were limits. I kept our conversations contained. I did not linger. I did not share personal updates. I did not ask about their lives beyond what was relevant to the work. This was not punishment. It was self-preservation. One afternoon, after a long meeting, my mother lingered as others logged off. She hesitated, then said she was proud of me. The words hung in the air, fragile and uncertain. I thanked her. I did not say more. I understood then that some things would never be resolved neatly. That closure did not always arrive in the form we imagine. Sometimes it came as the absence of expectation. As the project progressed, I felt a quiet satisfaction, not from watching them struggle, but from watching myself remain intact. I did not lose ground. I did not compromise my values. I did not trade my stability for approval. That was the real victory. There were still moments when the past flickered, when I remembered the girl who had left with a suitcase and a sentence echoing in her head. I felt tenderness for her now, not anger. She had done what she needed to do with the tools she had. I had more tools now. As the work moved toward its conclusion, I sensed another conversation approaching, one that would not be about timelines or deliverables, a conversation they had been avoiding, a conversation I had stopped chasing. I did not know how it would unfold. I only knew that whatever came next, I would meet it from where I stood now, not from where I had been. And for the first time, that felt like enough. The conversation they had been avoiding finally arrived disguised as something practical. It came at the end of a long workday, after deliverables were reviewed and timelines confirmed, when my father asked if we could talk for a few minutes after everyone else signed off. The request was careful, almost hesitant, and it carried a weight that had nothing to do with the project. I agreed and stayed seated while the screen cleared, watching their faces adjust now that there was no audience. My mother folded her hands together. My father shifted in his chair, straightening papers that no longer needed organizing. The silence stretched, familiar and uncomfortable, but this time I did not rush to fill it. He spoke first. He said he wanted to be clear about something. He said working with me had been eye-opening. He paused, searching for words that did not come easily. He said he had underestimated me. The sentence landed without the impact it once would have had. I registered it, acknowledged it, and waited. My mother added that she had seen how I handled pressure, how I led conversations, how people responded to me. She said she did not realize how much I had grown. Her voice trembled slightly, but she kept going. She said she regretted not supporting me sooner. I felt the old reflex stir, the instinct to soften, to reassure, to bridge the gap. I let it pass. I told them I appreciated their honesty. I said it mattered that they could see me clearly now. I did not say it erased the past. I did not say it fixed anything. My father nodded, like he understood the limitation of his words. He said there was something else he wanted to ask. He hesitated again, then asked if I would consider taking on a longer-term role, something more formal, something that would involve deeper involvement. The room felt suddenly smaller. I asked what he meant. He explained that the company needed stability, leadership they could trust. He said my perspective had been invaluable. He said bringing me on officially would send a strong signal. I listened carefully, not just to the words, but to the motivation behind them. This was not just about business, it was about restoration, about reclaiming something they had lost by pretending it had never mattered. I took a breath and asked a question I already knew the answer to. I asked what that role would look like in practice. Authority, decision-making, accountability. My father answered, but the edges were soft, the specifics vague. He talked around control without naming it. He spoke about collaboration, about shared vision. I waited until he finished. I told him I would not accept a role that placed me beneath people who had never respected my judgment. I told him I would not step into a structure designed to absorb my credibility without granting me real authority. I told him I would not undo years of independence for the appearance of reconciliation. My mother looked stricken. She asked if this was punishment, if I was holding a grudge. I shook my head. I said this was clarity. I explained that the opportunity they were offering came with invisible expectations, expectations I had lived under before, expectations that had required me to prove my worth over and over again to people who had already decided it was conditional. I said I was not interested in repeating that dynamic in a professional setting. My father leaned back, his expression tight. He asked if that meant I was saying no. I said it meant I was saying not like this. The silence returned, heavier than before. I could see frustration flicker across his face, followed by something else I had rarely seen there. Uncertainty. My mother spoke again, more softly this time. She said she did not know how to fix what had been broken. She said she felt like she was always one step behind, always reacting too late. I looked at her and felt a wave of compassion that did not require me to move backward. I told her some things could not be fixed, only acknowledged. I told her that trying to fix the past often damaged the present. She nodded slowly, tears gathering, but she did not argue. We ended the call shortly after, all of us aware that something significant had been said, even if nothing had been resolved. When the screen went dark, I sat alone for a long time, staring at my reflection in the black glass. I thought about the younger version of myself who would have given anything to hear those words. Underestimated you. Regret. Support. I thought about how much power they once held over me, how desperately I had wanted their approval. And I realized that the reason their words felt smaller now was not because they meant less, but because I needed them less. The days that followed were quieter. The project moved forward, steady and professional. No one mentioned the conversation. No one pushed. I noticed changes anyway. My father deferred more readily. My mother stopped trying to smooth things over. They respected my time. They followed my lead. It was subtle, but consistent. Respect, I learned, does not always come with apologies. Sometimes it arrives as changed behavior. That did not make the past disappear. It did not erase the sentence that had shaped my life. But it did something else. It confirmed that my worth was no longer theoretical. It was operational. One evening, as I wrapped up work, I received an invitation to speak at an event related to my field. The message praised my insight, my leadership, my impact. I accepted without hesitation. Later, my mother mentioned she had seen the announcement. She said she was impressed. I thanked her and moved on. That was the rhythm now. Acknowledgement without entanglement. Connection without collapse. Still, there was something unfinished hanging between us. A truth that had not yet been spoken out loud. Not by them, not by me. I knew it would come eventually. Not because I demanded it, but because avoidance has a shelf life. You can only work around a wound for so long before it asserts itself. As the project neared completion, I sensed the pressure building again, not from deadlines this time, but from something more personal. I felt it in the way my mother lingered at the end of calls, in the way my father studied my face when he thought I was not looking. They were waiting for permission. To say more. To ask for more. I was not sure yet what I would allow. One night, walking home, I passed a storefront with its lights still on. Someone inside working late, building something no one else could see yet. I stopped for a moment and watched, feeling an unexpected kinship. I thought about how far I had come, how many versions of myself had fallen away along the path. I thought about the cost of independence and the cost of staying silent. I knew the next conversation would not be about work. It would be about the sentence that started everything, the one we had all been circling without naming. When that moment came, I would not be asking for anything. I would be stating the truth. And whatever followed would finally tell me what kind of ending this story was meant to have. It happened on a morning that should have felt ordinary, the kind of morning where nothing announces itself as important until it already is. I was reviewing notes when my phone vibrated with a message from my mother asking if we could talk in person. Not about work, she added quickly. Just to talk. I did not answer right away. I read the message twice, noticing the care in the wording, the way she tried to sound calm while clearly bracing herself. I felt no spike of fear, no rush of obligation. Just a quiet understanding that this was the conversation we had been circling for weeks. I agreed and suggested a time and place that worked for me. We met in a small cafe halfway between our worlds, neutral and unremarkable, the kind of place where no one pays attention to anyone else. I arrived a few minutes early and chose a table near the window. The street outside was busy, people passing with purpose, lives unfolding without regard for ours. My mother arrived alone. That told me more than anything she could have said. She looked older than I remembered. Not dramatically so, but in the way stress settles into posture and breath. She smiled when she saw me, a soft, uncertain smile, and sat down across from me. Her hands wrapped around her cup as if she needed the warmth. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I watched her gather herself, saw the familiar instinct to manage, to smooth, to make things easier even when they were not. She started by talking about the weather, about traffic, about nothing at all. I let her. Some people need a runway before they can take off. Eventually, she stopped. She took a breath and looked directly at me. She said she wanted to talk about the past, about what had been said, about what had not. The words landed quietly, without drama. I nodded once, giving her permission to continue without offering reassurance. She told me she had replayed that night at the dining table more times than she could count. She said she remembered the way my father had spoken, the way I had gone silent. She said she had known something was wrong the moment the words left his mouth. She admitted she had chosen not to intervene. Not because she agreed, but because she was afraid. Afraid of conflict. Afraid of destabilizing what they had built. Afraid of what supporting me might cost them. Her voice wavered, but she did not stop. She said she had told herself it was temporary, that I would adjust, that I would choose something safer. She said she had believed, deep down, that I would come back and everything would settle back into place. She looked at me then, eyes wet but steady. She said she was wrong. I felt the truth of that statement move through me slowly, not like a wave, but like a tide. It did not knock me over. It did not pull me backward. It simply arrived. I told her I knew she was afraid. I told her I had seen it even then. I told her fear did not excuse what had been done, but I understood it better now. She nodded, tears slipping free despite her effort to contain them. She said she did not know how to apologize in a way that mattered. She said words felt too small. I considered that. I told her apologies mattered when they were paired with change. I told her I had seen change. Not perfection, but effort. That counted for something. She exhaled shakily, relief flickering across her face. Then she asked the question she had been carrying like a stone. She asked if I would ever forgive them. I did not answer immediately. I watched a couple at the next table laugh over something trivial. I listened to the hum of conversation around us. I gave myself the time I had once been denied. I told her forgiveness was not a single moment. It was a process. I told her I was not holding on to anger the way she might think. I told her I had built a life that did not revolve around their approval. I said forgiveness, for me, meant letting go of the need for them to be different than they were capable of being. It meant accepting the limits of who they were without letting those limits define me. She listened closely, nodding, absorbing every word. She asked if there was anything she could do now. I told her the most important thing she could do was respect the life I had built. Not try to rewrite it. Not try to insert herself into it out of guilt. Just respect it. She said she could do that. We sat quietly for a while after that, the heaviness easing into something more breathable. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no grand promises. Just two people acknowledging a truth that had been avoided for too long. When we stood to leave, she reached out hesitantly and touched my arm. Not gripping, not pleading, just a brief, gentle contact. She said she was proud of me. The words did not undo the past. They did not erase the sentence that had sent me out into the world alone. But they landed differently than they once would have. I thanked her, and meant it. As I walked back to my car, I felt lighter, not because everything had been resolved, but because I had finally spoken from a place of strength rather than need. That night, I thought about my father, about the way he avoided the conversation, about the silence he still carried. I understood now that his reckoning would look different, if it came at all. I did not feel the urge to chase it. The project wrapped up shortly after. The results were strong, the feedback positive. The work spoke for itself. My involvement ended cleanly on my terms. My parents did not ask for more. In the days that followed, I noticed something subtle but profound. I was no longer bracing for contact, no longer rehearsing responses in my head. The story had shifted from reaction to choice. I began to see my past not as a wound that needed constant tending, but as a scar that reminded me what I had survived. There was still one conversation left, I knew that. One that could not be mediated through my mother. One that required my father to face the sentence he had spoken so easily. I did not know if he would ever be ready, but I knew I was. And when that moment came, I would not be asking him to take it back. I would be telling him what it had built. He reached out 2 weeks after my conversation with my mother, not with an apology, not with explanations, but with a request that sounded almost formal. He asked if we could talk. Just the two of us. He suggested his office, then added that he was open to wherever I preferred. That small addition told me more than the rest of the message. I chose a quiet park near the river, public enough to keep the air honest, familiar enough that I would not feel like I was stepping back into his territory. I arrived early and walked along the path once, letting the rhythm of my steps steady me. The water moved steadily beside me, indifferent to anything we were about to say. I liked that. He arrived right on time. He looked the same and different at once, the same posture, the same careful clothes, but something in his face had softened, or maybe thinned. When he saw me, he stopped short, as if surprised by the distance between the person he remembered and the one standing in front of him. We sat on a bench facing the river. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The sound of water filled the space between us, along with the distant laughter of people passing behind. He cleared his throat and said my name. Not sharply, not casually, just my name, like he was testing it. He said he had been thinking a lot. He said working with me had forced him to confront some things he had avoided. He said he had watched how people responded to me, how they trusted my judgment, how they deferred. He said it was humbling. I listened without interrupting. I had learned the value of letting people finish when they were finally speaking honestly. He paused, his gaze fixed on the water. He said he wanted to talk about that night, the dining table, the sentence. My chest tightened, but not painfully, more like a muscle engaging for something it had trained for. He said he remembered saying it. He said he remembered how calm he had felt, how certain. He said he had believed he was being rational, responsible, protective of the family. He said he had not considered how it would land on me. I waited. He said he had spent years thinking his job was to manage risk, to minimize exposure, to make decisions that protected what he had built. He said somewhere along the way, he had started treating people the same way he treated numbers. He stopped then, swallowed, and said that included me. The words hung in the air, heavy and unadorned. He turned toward me and said he was sorry. It was not dramatic. It was not polished. It did not come with excuses. It was quiet and direct, like a door closing gently but firmly. I felt the moment stretch, waiting to see what I would do with it. I thought about the years that sentence had echoed in my head, the nights it had kept me awake, the choices it had forced, the person it had shaped. I told him I appreciated him saying it. I told him the sentence had changed the course of my life. I told him I had carried it with me longer than he probably realized. He nodded, his jaw tight. He said he could see that now. He said he had been wrong, not just about my abilities, but about what it meant to invest in someone. He said he thought investment was about money and outcomes. He said he understood now that it was also about belief. I told him belief had been the one thing I had needed most in that moment. I told him its absence had been clarifying in ways he could not have anticipated. He asked what I meant. I told him that being told I was not worth the investment had forced me to invest in myself fully or disappear. I told him there had been no middle ground. I told him that pressure had forged something strong, but that it had also come at a cost. He asked what cost. I told him it had cost me the illusion that my parents would always catch me if I fell. It had cost me a sense of safety I did not realize I was relying on. It had cost me years of carrying doubt that did not belong to me. He listened, his shoulders slumping slightly with each sentence, not in defeat, but in recognition. He said he wished he could take it back. I told him taking it back was not the point. I told him what mattered was understanding what it had built. I told him I did not need him to rewrite the past. I needed him to see the present clearly. He looked at me then, really looked, and nodded. He asked if I thought we could have a relationship going forward, not professionally, not strategically, just as father and daughter. The question was careful, almost tentative. I told him the answer depended on respect. I told him I would not accept a relationship where my choices were second-guessed, where my worth was measured against his expectations. I told him I was open to something new, but not to something familiar. He said he understood. He said he did not want to control or manage me anymore. He said he wanted to know me. I believed him, not because his words were perfect, but because his posture had changed. He was not leaning forward, not trying to steer the conversation. He was listening. We sat in silence for a while after that, watching the river move past. The moment did not demand more words. Before we stood to leave, he said one more thing. He said he was proud of me. Not because I had succeeded, but because I had held my ground. He said that took courage he did not have at my age. I thanked him. As we walked back toward our cars, I noticed how light my steps felt. Not buoyant, not euphoric, just unburdened. That night, alone in my apartment, I sat on the floor by the window and let the city lights blur together. I thought about how many versions of closure I had imagined over the years, how dramatic I had expected it to be, how loud. This had been quiet, honest, enough. I realized then that closure does not always arrive with a bow tied neatly around it. Sometimes it arrives as the absence of tension you have been bracing against for so long you forgot it was there. The next morning, I woke up and moved through my day without the familiar undercurrent of vigilance. I noticed it in small ways: how my shoulders stayed relaxed in meetings, how my thoughts did not drift backward as often, how my energy felt directed forward instead of split between past and present. I was no longer proving anything to anyone. That was the real shift. In the days that followed, my parents respected the space we had defined. They did not push. They did not intrude. When we spoke, it was measured and mutual. When we did not, it was comfortable. I began to understand something important. Reconciliation did not mean returning to who we had been. It meant acknowledging who we were now. One evening, as I prepared notes for an upcoming presentation, I caught my reflection in the dark screen of my laptop. I looked different to myself. Not older. Clearer. I thought about the sentence that had started everything, how final it had sounded, how absolute. It had not ended me. It had revealed me. And as I closed my laptop and turned off the light, I felt ready for the final step. Not another conversation. Not another reckoning. Just the quiet act of living fully, without the shadow of that judgment trailing behind me. The story had reached its last turning point. All that remained was to let it settle into the life I had built. The sense of completion did not arrive all at once. It unfolded gradually, in the way a room feels warmer long before you notice the heater has turned on. I realized it on a quiet morning when I sat at my desk and began my work without checking my phone first. No scanning for messages, no bracing for disappointment. Just focus. Just presence. For most of my life, my parents' opinions had been the invisible background noise to every decision I made. Even when I told myself I was free, part of me still waited for the echo of their approval or their doubt. That morning, the echo was gone. I worked for hours, lost in the familiar flow of concentration, the kind that makes time disappear. When I finally leaned back and stretched, sunlight had shifted across the floor. I felt tired, but it was the good kind of tired, the kind that comes from effort rather than anxiety. Later that day, I met a client for coffee, an older woman with sharp eyes and a calm confidence that comes from having survived several versions of herself. We talked about the project, but also about life. She mentioned her grown children, how different they were, how she had learned too late that love could not be measured by outcomes. She looked at me for a long moment and said something that stayed with me. She said parents often confuse fear with wisdom, and children pay the price for that confusion. Then she smiled gently and said it looked like I had learned to stop paying. I laughed, surprised by how seen I felt. When we parted ways, I walked back to my office with a lightness that had nothing to do with success and everything to do with understanding. That evening, my mother called. Not because she needed anything, not because something was wrong. She called to tell me she had tried a new recipe and it had not turned out well. She sounded amused, not embarrassed. She asked what I was making for dinner. I told her the truth. Something simple, something easy. There was a pause, and then she said, "That sounded nice." We did not talk long. We did not revisit old wounds. We did not perform reconciliation. The call ended naturally, without tension or guilt, and when I set my phone down, I felt no urge to analyze it. That was when it truly sank in. I was no longer living inside unfinished conversations. The days that followed carried the same quiet steadiness. My parents remained part of my life, but they no longer occupied the center of it. They existed at the edges, where they belonged, without controlling the narrative. I thought often about the moment that changed everything, the sentence spoken so casually at the dining table. Not worth the investment. For a long time, those words had felt like a verdict handed down by the people whose judgment mattered most. Now I saw them differently. They were not a verdict. They were a confession. A confession of fear, of limited imagination, of an inability to see value that could not be predicted or controlled. That understanding did not make me feel superior. It made me feel free. One afternoon, as I cleaned out old files on my computer, I came across early work I had done, rough and uncertain, full of mistakes and ambition. I smiled as I scrolled through it, not with embarrassment, but with affection. That version of me had worked with what she had. She had believed enough to keep going when belief was scarce. I saved a few of those files into a folder and labeled it Beginnings. That night, I met friends for dinner. Women of different ages, different paths, but similar histories. We talked about careers, relationships, parents, the complicated legacy of being raised to be agreeable instead of assertive. One woman admitted she was still waiting for her father to acknowledge her success. Another said she had given up on that years ago and had never felt lighter. I listened and realized something quietly profound. Closure does not come from the other person saying the right thing. It comes from no longer needing them to. When I returned home, I stood by the window and watched the city settle into evening. Lights flickered on. Lives continued. Somewhere, my parents were likely doing the same thing, moving through their routines, adjusting slowly to a version of me they had not planned for. I felt no urge to prove anything to them, no urge to explain myself again. That chapter was complete. Weeks passed. Time did what time does best. It softened edges. It reinforced habits. It made my new normal feel ordinary, which was the greatest gift of all. Then, one afternoon, my father called. He did not preface the call with formality. He asked how my day was going. I told him. He listened. He did not interrupt. When I finished, he said he was glad I sounded happy. The word happy lingered. I thanked him. We talked a little longer, then hung up. I sat there for a moment, letting the simplicity of the exchange wash over me. There was no dramatic resolution, no final declaration, just mutual recognition. That was enough. I began to understand that my story did not end with reconciliation or revenge. It ended with self-trust, with the knowledge that I could walk away from judgment without carrying it with me, with the certainty that my worth did not require consensus. I was never the bad investment. I had simply invested in myself in a way my parents could not understand at the time. And when that investment began to pay off, the returns were not just professional or financial, they were emotional, psychological, existential. I had built a life that fit me, not one designed to keep others comfortable. On a quiet Sunday, I wrote in my journal for the first time in months. I did not write about my parents. I wrote about the future, about projects I wanted to pursue, about places I wanted to see, about the kind of relationships I wanted to nurture. The absence of that old weight made room for something else, possibility. If you are hearing this story and feeling the echo of your own experiences, especially if you are someone who spent years being underestimated by the people who were supposed to believe in you first, I want you to know this. You do not have to wait for validation to live fully. You do not have to convince anyone that your dreams are sensible enough to support. Sometimes the bravest act is investing in yourself without a safety net, trusting that your value will become evident through the life you build, not the arguments you make. If this chapter resonated with you, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Your stories matter more than you realize, especially when they remind others they are not alone. Stay with the channel and keep choosing the life that feels true to you. That choice, made again and again, is how real freedom begins.